During the late 1880s, an audacious endeavor was set forth by the Radziner Rebbe, aimed at renewing the ancient legacy of Techeles through his arduous quest to rediscover the elusive chilazon. However, amidst his fervor, a tide of opposition emerged. In this class, our attention turns to the objections raised by the Rebbe Rashab, carefully outlined in a letter authored in 1907 after having read the works of the Radziner Rebbe. In the year 1907, the Rebbe Rashab sent a letter. It was Chof Shvat Tov Reish Samach Zayin. He sent a letter to the Radziner Rebbe. This was the fourth Rebbe of the Radzin dynasty. His name was Reb Mordechai Yosef Eliezer. And the letter, the Rebbe Rashab was in Würzburg at the time, and not in Lubavitch. And he sent the letter from Würzburg. The letter says as follows: Sifrei kvoid aviv harav hatzadik zal asher kibdani b'hem kvoid teirasai kibalti ba'ava. The svarim from your father, his father, the third Rebbe of Radzin, was Reb Gershon Chanech. Your father's svarim I received from you. They had just been reprinted recently. A number of them had been reprinted about 3 years earlier. And they were sent to the Rebbe Rashab. And the Rebbe Rashab thanks him very much. He's very happy that he received these for him. Why? I've long wanted to see these Svarim. I never had the chance really to see them. However, the Rebbe Rashab then adds the following line, right in the beginning. Thank you very much for the Svarim, but al etzam ha'inyan, about the idea, about the proposal, I cannot agree whatsoever. So what are we talking about over here? What are these books about? And what is Rebbe Rashab saying he can't agree with? So this brings us to this week's parsha, where we learn about the mitzvah of tzitzis and the mitzvah of Techeles. The lashon of the pasuk is Va'asu lahem tzitzis al kanfei v'dein l'dayroisa. We need to make tzitzis on the corners of our garments l'dayroisa, for all generations. The pasuk then continues and says, "V'nosnu al tzitzis hakanaf psil Techeles." That on the tzitzis we should put a thread of Techeles, a bluish type of thread is the mitzvah of Techeles. Now the Alshich points out something very interesting. There are many times in the Torah where it says this mitzvah is l'doiros chukas olam l'doiroseichem. Here also you have l'doirosa. However, it's not at the end of the pasuk. It's sandwiched in between. After it says you should put on the tzitzis, that's referring to the white strings, it says l'doiroisam, and then it says v'nasan al tzitzis hakanaf psil Techeles after the word l'doiroisam. Wouldn't it have made more sense if you say asalem tzitzis hakanfei vigdeya, number one, v'nasan al tzitzis hakanaf psil Techeles, and both of these things should be l'doiroisam or l'doiroisam. Zok the Alshich lived in Tzfas at the same time of the Arizal, and the Alshich writes that this is because the Torah is, so to speak, giving a nevuah that the first part of the pasuk is taka l'doiroisam. It's taka going to be for all generations that Yidden are going to be able to keep the mitzvah of the white strings, the lavan. However, the second half of the pasuk is taka not l'doiroisam. Why? Kiloi b'chol hadoiros nimtza dam chilazon. Not in all generations are we going to have the chilazon. That's because as follows. The Torah just says Techeles. Techeles presumably is a bluish color. How do you get this Techeles? So that information comes from Torah Shabbal Peh. We learn the Gemara, and the Gemara says that there's a certain marine creature called the chilazon. There are many different passages that describe what this marine creature are, and we'll talk more about that soon. And the only way, the proper way of making Techeles is if it's coming from the mucus or the dam of this particular chilazon. So the Alshich is saying that we don't have this chilazon. He's referring to his times. In his times we don't have the chilazon anymore, and that's why the word l'doiroisam is not presented together with the Techeles. It's a fascinating diuk in the pasuk. Subsequently, many other mefarshim have made a similar point. So now the question becomes, so when did the mitzvah of Techeles fall out of use? When did this happen? So if we look in the Gemara, we see there are a few passages where we're able to tell that in the times of Amoraim, there's still doing the mitzvah of Techeles. Here's one sample passage from Menachos Mem Gimel Amid Aleph. It says as follows: Mar, there's a person by the name of Mar. Memashche he's from the place of Memashche, from Mashche. I see Techelta, he brought his Techeles. Bishnei Rav Achoy, in the years of Rav Achoy. The Chidah tells us that this Rav Achoy is actually not an Amoira. He is a later Tkufa that's called the Rabbanon Sivuroi, which means as follows. Amoira is Malashon Hoira, it's just in the words of Aramaic, which means decisors, they're giving directives. They probably didn't call themselves Amoraim. They didn't say, hello, I'm an Amoira. That's not how they referred to themselves. Some names are given by later generations. Looking back, you say, that generation was a generation of Amoraim. So what happened was that at a certain point, you reach a time when the rabbis at a certain point say, they, in that generation, they could give emes ha'irois, they could paskin. They were in a situation where they could give directives. Us, our job is to explain, not to issue new directives. And that's why they call themselves the Rabbanon Sivuroi. Sivuroi means reasoning, the rabbis who give reasoning, versus the Amoraim who are giving the directives. All these names are actually meaningful in terms of what they mean. So this Rav Achoy is actually not an Amoira. Is Rabbanon Sivuroi. There are passages in the Gemara. The Rishonim already discussed this. There are passages in the Gemara that aren't attributed to the layer of the Amoraim. There's attributed to a later generation, after the Amoraim, to this generation of the Rabbanon Sivuroi that's between the Amoraim and the Goinim. Anyway, so one of these rabbis, his name, Rav Achoy, roughly will say he's living in the 7th century. I don't know if there's a way to exactly pinpoint. And this Mar brings, in the years that Rav Achoy is the Rav, he brings Techeles. But so now, the way you have this Gemara describing it, it sounds like Techeles is not an everyday phenomenon. If it's every day, you wouldn't say that, a certain man from a certain place brought it in those years. So you're able to tell that at this time of the Rabbanon Sivuroi, it exists, but it's not an everyday phenomenon, which makes a lot of sense. If you're living in Bavel, you're not living on the Mediterranean Sea. The chilazon is coming from the Mediterranean Sea, so you're at a distance. It makes sense that it would be, lav davka would be the easiest thing to have in Bavel. Anyway, the Gemara goes on to say that they did 2 tests on this Techeles. One test was Rav Yitzchak Bereder Rav Yehuda's test. Another test was Rav Ada's tests. What are these tests? This is to tell if it's authentic Techeles or if it's a copy. There are various copies that were possible to do they weren't coming from a chilazon. Those are puzzle. So they did the tests. The problem in this case was it passed one test and it failed another test. So the shayla of the Gemara is what was supposed to happen in that case. The bottom line is what you see from this Gemara, and there are other passages as well. You're seeing that in the Tkufa, the Amoraim, here even in the Tkufa, Rabbanon Sivuroi, still in the 7th century, we're able to say Techeles at least somewhat still exists. But when we move a little further forward in history, we start seeing rayas that the Techeles no longer exists. Before you have the sources that say so clearly, we have an implicit source where we're able to derive this. What's the first sefer that we have that comes post the Gemara? In other words, the Gemara is growing. More rabbis are being added to the Gemara. At a certain point, the Gemara stops. You have Siyum HaTalmud. Okay, so now if someone wants to write something, it's going to be outside the Gemara. So what's the first work that we have that's outside the Gemara? So the answer is, it's a sefer that's called Shiltis de Rav Achoy. He was one of the Goinim. First he lived in Bavel, where the Goinim of Bavel lived, and then he moved to Eretz Yisrael. Roughly in the 8th century is the time that he lived, in the 700s. So he has a sefer, it's called the Shiltis. And the Shiltis, what is it? It consists of, it goes Al Seder HaTorah, and it has the basic halachis about one topic in each parsha, or a few topics within each parsha. And so, when it comes to Parsha Shlach, this Shiltis, it doesn't, he discusses the dinim of tzitzis. He does not have any information about Techeles whatsoever. No information of Techeles. The 8th century. So now like this. In the 1800s, the Netziv wrote a commentary on the Shiltis. It's called Ha'amek She'ela. The Netziv is Rosh Yeshiva Volozhin of Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. And on this commentary on the Shiltis, he writes, V'Rabbeinu lo yehevi dinei Techeles klal. Rav Achoy Goin has no mention of the Techeles. What does this prove? And it's a pretty strong proof. Mishum shaloi hoya b'mkoimo zmanoi. Because he didn't have Techeles in his generation, he already didn't have Techeles. And you would expect that if Techeles was something that was at least theoretically part of Jewish life, he would have included it. But the fact that he talks about tzitzis and gives specifics about tzitzis, has no information on Techeles, that tells us that in this period, the period of the Go'onim, in the 8th century already, we can say that there is no Techeles. And then you go a little forward, a century or two, you start seeing the Rishonim saying clearly, we do not have Techeles anymore. And this is pretty much the story of Techeles for more than 1,000 years, until you come to the 19th century, and we come to the Radziner Rebbe, to the third Radziner Rebbe. His name is Reb Gershon Chanoich Leiner. And in 1887, Tov Reish Mem Zayin, he puts out a little pamphlet that's called Sfunei Tmunei Choil. These are words that come from Parshas Zos HaBracha, the bracha about Yisachar and Zvulun. And Moshe Rabbeinu was saying that they're going to live in an area that has a lot of treasures that are buried. Sfunei means covered. Tmunei also means covered. Choil is dirt. So these buried treasures. And Rashi on the Pasuk Chazal tell us that this, amongst other things, it's a reference to the Techeles. That the Techeles is hidden. It's hidden in the sea or in the area of the sea. And so that's one of the treasures that these Shvatim had in their Nachala. So that's the name of the Sefer. Obviously put it out because the book is going to be about Techeles. And what does the title page say? It says as follows: Maimer Tzfunei Tmunei Choil V'hu Bir Halacha B'Metzias HaChilazon Af Bizmanenu. I want to establish that the chilazon could exist, not some mythical creature. It could exist in our time. Im nuchol lahasigoy, and can we get it? Ulitzbaya by Techeles, and die the Techeles l'kayim mitzvahs tzitzis b'shleimus, in order to do mitzvahs b'shleimus, because the mitzvah really is supposed to happen with Techeles. There's one mitzvah of tzitzis. That's the way the Rambam rules, one mitzvah. They're not ma'akev. In other words, if you don't have Techeles, you could still do the mitzvah of lavam, but everyone agrees that it's preferable to have the Techeles. So for many centuries, Jews basically gave up and said, it's not here, maybe it doesn't even exist, and it's not coming back till Mashiach comes. And so the Radziner Rebbe puts out this work, and he wants to say, no, this marine creature exists, and we could identify, and we could figure out how to do the dyeing, and this is something that we should do. He didn't do anything yet. In this work, he's just saying that this is something that we should do. Well, a year later, in Tov Reish Mem Ches, in the year 1888, he puts out another work, also very short, called Maimer Psil Techeles, the thread of Techeles. And here already he has developments. Now he's not only talking theoretical, he's talking about something that he actually executed. The end of the book, he writes, I authored this book in the year of Mitzius Chilazon. The words Mitzius Chilazon, that the chilazon exists, that's Gematria 648. 648, if you start from 1240, which is the year 5000, comes out to the year he was in, the year 1888. So it's Shnas Mitzius Chilazon Leprat Kata. What does he write? So let's see what he writes in this little pamphlet on pages 3 to 5. He says as follows: We took on the difficult burden to travel to a faraway country. We went from where he was living in Poland, in Radzin. We went to Italy, specifically to the city of Naples. And there they have a big zoological institution over there. It's a large building built from stone. It goes deep into the earth, and it's at the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And there you have all different types of marine creatures that are in the wild, so to speak, because they're living in what appears to be their natural habitat, and you're able to observe them by looking through glass walls. In other words, he's describing an aquarium. And that's where he says, I saw the chilazon living, chai, hoylef, chafshi, swimming freely, and now, hineni lirshan kol simalav, I'm going to describe what this marine creature looks like. And he goes on for a good 2-3 pages telling us all the details about this creature. This building, this institution exists still today in Naples. It's called the Anton Dorn Zoological Station. It was built in 1872. And so in the 1880s it existed. And this is where he went all the way from Poland to Naples in order to discover the chilazon. Let's read a little of the specifications that he says. So he gives the scientific names for it, which we'll skip over. And then he says that generally speaking, the population calls it the tintin fish. Tint is ink. It's called the ink fish. Why? And he goes on to say because within its body it has a dark, blackish ink inside a sac, and it has an opening where it's able to empty out this ink through this opening. He says this should not be confused. Chazal used the word dam, blood. This should not be confused with the substance within a body that carries oxygen, that sustains a being and allows the creature to be alive. No. That's separate. This, independent of that blood, it has this type of ink. And when it is being pursued and is about to be caught by a predator, that's when it issues forth this ink in order to muddy the waters. In other words, to create a camouflage, some sort of smoke screen, in order that he's then able to go and disappear. What fish are we talking about? He's talking about what's called, in common parlance, the cuttlefish. This is the fish that he's referring to, and he says this is the Techeles, and he goes on to establish why he thinks so in this work at great length. So that's all in the work that he publishes in 1888 in Tafresh Mem Ches. Now fast forward to 3 years, Tafresh Nun Aleph, in the year 1891, he passed away. And so this is all of this action is happening very close to the time of his passing. Now what happens is, after he passes away, about a year later, his son, with whom the Rebbe Rashab is corresponding, Reb Mordechai Yosef Eliezer, the fourth Rebbe, puts out a work that his father had written and didn't have the chance to publish yet. And this one is called Ein Techeles, the color of Techeles. And in this work, the Radziner writes as follows. It was on the first day of Hanukkah in the year 1888, the end of the year 1888, Shnas Tafresh Mem Tes. Acharei harbe nisyonos ubdikos b'yigir rabba, a lot of testing and a lot of pilot programming. Allah biyadi be'ezas Hashem yisbarach lisbaya hayoyra rishayna. We successfully did the first batch of Techeles, of Zman Kasser, and shortly thereafter we had Eza Alafim Yisrael, a number of thousands of Jews, a few thousands of Jews, probably Radziner Chasidim, going around with Techeles. And so that's pretty much the story that you have. It's a story that hits the Jewish world in 1887 with his first publication, and then by 1889 or 1888, the end of the year, on Hanukkah, he already has successfully created this ink, this dye, and the people are going around with this Techeles. As I said, shortly thereafter he passes away, but his child picks it up from there and continues promoting this mitzvah for as long as possible, which is why he republishes his father's Svarim in the year Tafrei Samach Dalet in 1904, and it's then those copies that he sends to the Rebbe Rashab in Tafrei Samach Zayin, because this was what he's doing. He's continuing to send these Svarim to other Gdolei Yisrael, trying to get them on board. In 1880s, the Rebbe Rashab was not an international figure. The Rebbe Rashab in the 1880s was still not even officially the Rebbe. It's only sometime in the 1890s, Tafresh Nun Daled, that the Rebbe Rashab became the Rebbe. Even after he became the Rebbe, he wasn't yet an international figure, and he definitely was not weighing in on these types of issues. But as you got to the late 1890s and the early 1900s, that's when the Rebbe Rashab started becoming more of a public figure, writing public letters about issues that related to Am Yisrael, Zionism, for example, and other issues like that. And now is a time when you come to the year 1907, where it makes sense that the Radziner Rebbe would want to hear what the Rebbe Rashab has to say and try to get the Rebbe Rashab on board to this program. Now we already know that Rebbe Rashab writes right away in the beginning, Al etzam inyan ef shalahaskim. There's nothing what to talk about. I can't sign on to the program of Techeles, and the main work that we have to do tonight is to understand why. However, all the way at the end, the Rebbe Rashab writes the following passage, and I want to go to this passage right now. He says as follows: the way you describe the chilazon, or the way your father describes the chilazon in the second work, Psil Techeles, it seems pretty clear to me that I saw this creature about 20 years earlier, but Aquarium de Berlin. We know from elsewhere that in Tafresh Mem Tes, 1889, the Rebbe Rashab was visiting Berlin. Here we learn that he's saying 20 years earlier, he's writing this in 1907, 20 years earlier, I'm pretty sure I saw this creature I saw this cuttlefish in Berlin. He describes a black fluid, which darkens the water around it. Ulefi shaloi ola al daiti shezeh yeh chilazon. I didn't consider that this will be the chilazon. So lo samti libi la'ayin al kol pratav. I didn't pay attention to think about all of its specific details. It's a very interesting passage here. Number one, you've all been to an aquarium. You could tell me what you saw in the aquarium 20 years later. Number one. But number two, the main thing is as follows. What's probably obvious to all of us sitting around this table. Once the Radziner came out with his work, he had opposition. And the opposition came from many different Gedolei Yisrael. And while there's so many different points that you can get into, and each one of these could really be a class for itself, we'll talk about some basic points. One major point of opposition is, you think that's the chilazon? It can't be that's the chilazon. Why can't it be the chilazon? Because if you collect all the Mamorei Chazal about the chilazon, I'm sure not every single one of them match up with this particular creature. And so therefore, yeah, those who said, how could you say this cuttlefish is a chilazon? It goes against this or this fact. That's one major school of opposition, is those from this class. Then you have another issue. The other issue is a big machlokas, what the color of Techeles is supposed to look like. Is it supposed to be this type of blue, that type of blue, lighter, darker, a tinge of black, not a tinge of black? And so how are we going to get involved in something we can't resolve it? And so therefore other Gedolei Yisrael said for that reason we want to stay at it. Then you have another thing, and that is how exactly is the dyeing process supposed to look, even if this is the chilazon, and even if you know what color, but there's a certain way that it's described by Chazal and by the Rambam on how you do the dyeing process. Do we really know? Are we going to get it entirely right? And that's another reason to be. There are other reasons why some Gedolei Yisrael objected, but these are some three basic ones that many till today have pointed out why they have issues with Techeles. Here we see about the first one. That is the question of identifying this as the chilazon. The Rebbe Rashab doesn't take an issue with it. Doesn't say, by the way, I doubt that this is the chilazon. In fact, in a certain way, he almost seems to be okay with it. I'm not saying that the Rebbe Rashab is endorsing that this is the chilazon. I'm not saying that. But there's nothing in his language that he doesn't have any hesitation. You want to say this is the chilazon? Fine, you can say this is the chilazon. And the reason is, because as you're going to see, his opposition that the Rebbe Rashab is going to have doesn't matter. Even if it's taka the chilazon, it's not going to make a difference, as we're soon going to see. Which is why the Rebbe Rashab seems to almost be okay with the fact that this could in fact be the chilazon. Okay, so now that raises a question. So why are we taka not interested in saying that we're going to embrace this mitzvah? So interestingly, the main nekuda of this letter is al pi Kabbalah. The Rebbe Rashab's argument, he starts with a passage in Likutei Torah in this week's parsha, in Parsha Shlach, where the Alter Rebbe says as follows. I just need a little bit of akdam. A lot of material in Kabbalah and Chassidus discusses the spheres. And within the spheres, there's Chachma and Bina. Chachma is higher than Bina, and that's going to be important for this presentation, because Chachma comes first for a reason. It's higher. Also in the intellectual process of the person, first the person has Chachma, which is the initial flash of wisdom, so that's the higher level. Secondarily is when the person has Bina, and that's the full analysis of the idea. Sometimes we compare Chachma Bina to a seed, is Chachma, and going in the ground, where it fully develops into a plant, that's Bina. Another way of dividing Chachma and Bina is male and female for the same reason. The male gives forth the initial seed, and if it's within the woman's body that it develops into a full fetus. Which is why Chachma is called Abba, the father, and Bina is called Ima, the mother. So, with that background, let's read. It says, Alter Rebbe in Likutei Torah, Techeles corresponds to Moichin the Abba. In simple words, Techeles is the sphere of Chachma. The Lavan and the white strings, that's Moichin the Ema. That represents Bina. Lachein, says Alter Rebbe, Bezeh hazman ein Techeles. There's no Techeles bezman hazeh. Why? Because it's such a lofty level. It's from Chachma, it's from the level of Abba. It can't descend, it can't be present in our lives, it can't have an influence in our world. Bisman Agolos. Bisman Abayis, he implies you had Techeles. Why? Because Jews had access to the higher sphere of Chachma. And to therefore the corresponding mitzvah, which is Techeles, could be an active force in Jewish life. But when we come to Zman HaGolos, here we kind of lose touch with Sfiras HaChachma. It's out of our league. We're still in a relationship with the Sfira of Bina, and so therefore the white strings we could do, the Techeles we cannot do. Where is Alter Rebbe getting this idea from? So the Rebbe Rashab writes that this is really miyusid on the Arizal. So we'll see how the Arizal discusses this in the writings of Reb Chaim Vital. One of the Sfarim he wrote is called Pri Etz Chaim. And in Pri Etz Chaim he has a pretty lengthy discussion on this issue. We'll read it inside. Before we read it inside, I just need to tell you that the Arizal has this whole discussion within Bina. This gets a little confusing, but you can do this. Kahalt Kap. Every Sfira includes all the Sfiras in it. That means that within Chachma you could talk about all 10 Sfiras. In Bina you could talk about all 10 Sfiras. The Arizal does that. He says Tzitzis is all in Bina. Within Bina there's the Chachma part, that's going to be the Techeles, and then there's the Bina part, which is going to be the white strings. Let's see inside. Says Arizal, Min HaMoichin De'ema Yoitzin Beis Minei Tzitzis. There are two types of Tzitzis within Bina. Ha'alef, the first level is Dalit Tzitzis Min Moya Chachma De'ema. It's the Chachma within Ima. And that's tzitzis, the way it was observed in the times of the Beis HaMikdash HaYakayim. And when you're doing the mitzvah that way, you're going to have 7 white strings and 1 blue string. Why? Because you're tapping Chachma. Again, he's doing Chachma within Bina, but the main point is you're tapping Chachma, the higher sphere. Avol achar Churban. Once we reach the Churban Beis HaMikdash, Hemakol Chut Elevanim. It's all white. Ve'ein lanu Techeles. We have no Techeles. Why? All of the tzitzis that we have in our days, after the times of the Beis HaMikdash, is B'chinas Dalid Moichin, De Bina, De Ima. It's because we're all in Bina right now. We're all in Bina right now. We don't have the ability to do Techeles. We only reach the level of Bina within Bina, not Chachma within Bina. So this is where the Alter Rebbe is getting this idea from. He's getting from the Pri Etz Chaim. Okay, so really you could stop here. We can end the shir. Now why do we not have Techeles b'zman hazeh? We don't have Techeles b'zman hazeh because once you have the Churban Beis HaMikdash, we can't tap the higher level of Chachma, and therefore the mitzvah that corresponds with it is something that we no longer observe. However, we all recognize that that isn't really going to work. And the Rebbe Rashab notes that as well. As he says, in his letter he writes, we can't say this. The Mishum Zeh Yipater Mitzvahs Techeles. Because of this Kabbalistic reason, you're not going to be obligated to do the mitzvah of Techeles. The Vadai mitzvah mitzvah tmidis. This mitzvahs are eternal. We don't play games with mitzvahs. If we have the ability to do the mitzvahs, I don't care if this sphere, if it's that sphere. Maybe it's interesting, it's important to know, but at the end of the day, a Shulchan Aruch is a Shulchan Aruch. And so if the Shulchan Aruch tells you that you need to go ahead and do a certain mitzvah, even if al pi Kabbalah you think it doesn't correspond with the reality, you have to go ahead and do the mitzvah. And so therefore we need to deepen our understanding of why Take, this is in fact the reason not to do the mitzvah of Techeles today. And for this, the Rebbe Rashab moves us over to a new sugya, to a new conversation, and that is the conversation about Shofar on Rosh Hashanah. A very similar conversation happens about Lulav on Sukkot, that when it falls on Shabbos, there's a mitzvah min ha-Torah to blow Shofar on Shabbos, and yet we don't do it. What's the reason? The Gemara calls it the Gzeira that was taught us by Rabbah. What? Not that the Gzeira was made by Rabbah. Rabbah is teaching us the Gzeira from earlier generations. What was the Gzeira? That we're afraid that someone who doesn't know the dinim very well is going to take the shofar and to get trained of how to blow it on Shabbos, and now he's over on the prohibition of carrying Dalet Amis in the Rishus HaRabbah. So the Alter Rebbe has a mimer about this, and he asked a very simple question: Ma ro Chazal laker mitzvahs hasei the shofar v'lulav? How can you say that Chazal uprooted the mitzvahs hasei of shofar v'lulav mishum gzeira d'Rabba ba'ama for this concern? This is a concern that you're having for marginal people. How do they take away the mitzvah? In other words, the Alter Rebbe is telling us there must be more to the story. It is not possible to say that the entire reason why we stopped shofar on Rosh Hashanah is because of this gzeira. So what's the deeper thing? So Alter Rebbe goes on in this Ma'amar L'Kutei Torah to say, but rather than seeing in the long form of the Alter Rebbe, let's see how the Rebbe Rashab summarizes the idea. What is the Kabbalistic explanation? It goes as follows: B'Shabbos balav hachi yesh hamshachas ha'er shemamshichim aidei ha'shofar u'mamela eino nitzach l'shofar. On Shabbos we have anyway the same the same energy that we get through the mitzvah of shofar. So therefore you don't need the shofar. In other words, as follows: important to recognize that within Kabbalah, and both a mitzvah and a Yom Tif is not just a commemoration of an event that happened a long time ago. Or a mitzvah isn't just to remind you about something. We learned recently in Rambam about the shofar. It's to remind you, Ur Yushenim Mishinaschem. So it's there to remind you. It's to create a certain mental awareness, right? Chassidus Kabbalah goes on a different level. A Yom Tif, why is a Yom Tif a special day? Because a certain audacious, the world's a different place on this day. There's special energies that's touching the world, that's touching the neshama, that's touching us on this day. That's a Yom Tif. And a mitzvah, every mitzvah also draws Hashem's light into our neshama, into our world in one way or another. On Shabbos, whatever you're going to get through the shofar, you have automatically by Shabbos. So automatically, now we understand, why did Chazal push off the mitzvah from Gzeira D'Rabba? It wasn't only Gzeira D'Rabba. It was because anyway they felt it was less necessary to have this mitzvah. However, the Rebbe Rashab, summarizing the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, says, hold on, we have a problem here. What's the problem? The problem is the Torah itself tells you, blow the shofar on Shabbos. So how can you tell me, oh yeah, we don't need it on Shabbos because Shabbos gives us what the shofar gives us? What do you mean? The Torah tells us, I know it's Shabbos, and by the way, you should blow the shofar. So what's happening over here? So the emes is as follows. The reason there is a chiyuv min ha-Torah to blow the shofar on Shabbos is because the madrega that we tap through Shabbos and through shofar, there's actually multiple levels. And Shabbos actually can give you something that shofar can't give you. Taka gives you a deeper level, gives you a more profound or. And therefore, even on Shabbos, you taka have a chiyuv to blow the shofar, which is why it says so in the Torah. Okay, so then what happened? What happened is that then we came to Bayis Sheni. And when we came to Bayis Sheni, so then the ultimate hamshacha of shofar, now we lost the ability to tap it. And so it is only in this reality we say, now we have a double. Now we have a double. Earlier, when we were living the ideal world, in the time of Bayis Rishon, say here, Rosh Hashanah, that gives you a Shabbos, it gives you a major dose, 100%. Shofar is still giving you more. Shofar is still giving you more. You come to the time of Bayis Sheni, now all of a sudden, whatever you're getting from shofar, you already have from Shabbos. And so therefore, this is why, in this generation, they looked and they said, so on one hand, I have a concern. On the other hand, it's no longer really doing anything for me. So putting those two things together, let's say, Sheva al Taseh, you don't have a chiyuv to go and take the shofar and to take the lulav on Yom Tov. U'makol makom, says the Rebbe Rashab. Nonetheless, even during Bayis Sheni, there wasn't a blanket opposition to blowing the shofar. In fact, they blew the shofar on Shabbos. Where? In the Beis HaMikdash. In the Beis HaMikdash, they still did it. Why? Because whatever you were able to do in all of Klal Yisrael, all over Eretz Yisrael, during Bayis Rishon, where although it was Shabbos, still they were able to go on a higher level through shofar, all of that was still achievable in the small confines of the Beis HaMikdash. You were still able to elevate over the Shabbos through shofar, and so therefore it stayed over there. Okay, so this is the model that the Alter Rebbe provides for us about this mitzvah. And what do we learn here? What's the key? What's the key here? The key over here is you need to have two things. You need to have two things. On the one hand, Kabbalah is not going to suffice. Hamshachis, oidus, and energy in and of itself is not going to be enough to say, we don't need that mitzvah anymore. It's a factor, but it can't be the sole factor. On the other hand, achshash kal, that in and of itself cannot be a reason to not do such a major mitzvah because we're afraid that one guy is going to buy a mistake. That doesn't. But as the two together, they work nice as a shidduch. Where, if we reach a situation where, Kabbalistically, the mitzvah is not providing us anything over Shabbos, and in addition to that we have a chash, then paired together, that could result in the Chachamim saying, Shev al Tasa, don't go ahead and don't do the mitzvah. The Rebbe Rashab wants to bring that in over here into our conversation and say that we have the same thing over here. Kabbalistically, I'm saying the same thing. You cannot access, just like Rosh Hashanah, we're saying you cannot access that higher audacious of the shofar on Shabbos. Same thing here. You cannot access the higher audacious of Chachma. However, you need to have something else. You need to have some sort of chash. Yeah. So, when it comes to shofar, the rabbis, they made the whole thing turn on which issue that maybe a guy is going to carry on Shabbos. So we're yaspik, that's not, in other words, how big is that chash? How big is a concern? How many of you are anxious that maybe someone end up carrying? No one really thinks that this is a major concern. And yet, that was enough. That's a nice, good 1-2 punch to tell us not to do the mitzvah. Same thing here. Yaspikan, t'chshash t'kalayim shaloi b'makom mitzvah. We have over here a chshash. What's the chshash? Maybe someone is going to carry the shofar on Shabbos. The chshash over here is that someone is going to violate the issue of kalayim when, in a time, shaloi b'makom mitzvah. These words are going to come a little clear in a second. Ubefrat, especially when we're not considering a talis gadol, which is always wool. But a talis katan, kama anoshim pshutim, noisim shaloi mitzamer. There are numerous people, simple people, who wear non-wool. And I think he means to say, and therefore it's a linen talis. And if you're going to have everyone wearing techeles, and this is what you're trying to do, the Radziner. You want to make that everyone's going to wear techeles. If you're going to have everyone wearing techeles, it's not a remote chance where you're going to have someone having kalayim. Why? Because you're going to have a talis katan made out of linen. Techeles always is a wool string. He's going to put his wool string on his linen tzitzis, and that in and of itself is not a problem. Why is that in and of itself not a problem? Because the asay of tzitzis pushes off the lois asay of kalayim. So that in and of itself is not a problem. But the chiyuv of tzitzis is only beyoyim. And so he's going to be wearing it right now, right around time when it's getting dark. And right now, at this moment, he's wearing shatnez shaloi b'makom mitzvah. Now you don't have the asay pushing off the lois asay, and right now, bam, we found a isser. We found a concern here of kilayim. Now the emes is that Chazal thought about this problem. And because of this problem, Chazal actually said that whoever wears a ksus shel pishton, if you taka have linen tzitzis, you're not allowed to put techeles on it. Why? Because we're afraid. You're going to wear it at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and you're good, right? But what if you forget to take it off before 9 o'clock at night? And so therefore Chazal already told us in the Gemara, if you're wearing linen, you're not allowed to put semer on no point at any time in any day. Okay? This is clarified by the Rambam in Hilchos Tzitzis, Per Gimel Halacha Zayin. This is what he said. He says, again, asay doichalois asay, but we're afraid that you're going to forget to take it off later, and so therefore you're not allowed to put techeles on a ksus shel pishton. So what does the Rebbe Rashab seem to be saying? The Rebbe Rashab seems to be saying, yeah, but what if someone doesn't listen to that? What if someone doesn't listen to that and he experiments with a linen tzitzis, and now everyone's wearing techeles, and he goes and puts on techeles, and now he's wearing it at night, and so we end up having a chshash of a isser. The Rebbe Rashab is not the first to propose the problem of kilayim. In fact, the Tiferes Yisrael, the commentator who wrote the Yachin Uvayas commentary on the Mishnah in the 1800s, Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz, so in his Hakdama to Seder Moyed, he writes as follows. Let's read the passage number 17. Ein noyagim b'tcheles b'tzitzis. We don't do tcheles. Why? So he gives his reason. Mede'ein anu bikiyin ba'oisan samamonin shehisker asha sheyivdeku bahen. His concern here is a different concern. We didn't speak about this concern so far. Chazal have a whole discussion how to determine if your techeles is real or not. And they give you a whole experiment to do to figure it out. We alluded to it earlier when there were two different ones, when they brought the techeles to Rav Achoy in the times of the Rabbanan Sivuroi. So he says, we don't know how to do that test today. If you don't know how to do that test today, then that's another reason not to wear the techeles. But then he goes on and it says, Lefichach, therefore, mid'ein techeles ma'akav l'lavan. You don't need techeles. You could still wear tzitzis without techeles. So that's number 2. Number 1, we don't know how to do the test. Number 2, you can get away with tzitzis without techeles. Number 3, v'ik chshash shatnis. There is a chshash shatnis. Number 3, so he's mentioning the same thing the Rebbe Rashab mentions. Lahachi batlu bimei ha'ga'oinim l'tcheles lagamri. Therefore, in the era of the ga'oinim, tcheles was nisbatal. Who was mavatal it? He doesn't tell us. Just as batlu. It therefore became batal. The Rebbe Rashab is mentioning the same idea. It doesn't really tell us who is behind this. But what both of them are saying is that there's a confluence of reasons that work together to tell us not to do techeles. For the Tiferes Yisrael, it's, I don't know how to do the test, together with the fact that there's a chshash shatnis. Therefore, batal. For the Rebbe Rashab, it's more the shofar model. The shofar model is, it's not really doing anything for me spiritually anyway, as a Kabbalist could know. Okay, but that in and of itself is not enough. Oh, but I also have the chash, just like Rosh Hashanah Shema Yavirenu. I also have the chash, and for that reason, also batal. Is the Rebbe Rashab and Techeles Yisrael saying that there was a bezdin that got around one day and they passed this legislation? We have no record of something of the sort. In fact, we have a record of Chazal not being worried about that. Because Chazal said, we are concerned about Techeles, and our solution is, shatnez, we are concerned about shatnez, and our solution is simply to say, never put Techeles on a linen talis. And they were happy with that, and they didn't feel the need to go an extra step. That's the record that we have from the Gemara. Here we're seeing an extra step. Oh no, but maybe someone's not going to listen, and he's going to put his Techeles on his linen. Something the Gemara didn't seem too concerned about is something that the Rebbe Rashab and Techeles Yisrael is saying became a concern. Bimei hagoinim. At least Techeles Yisrael is saying bimei hagoinim. I don't think that they assume here that there was a meeting and they passed this legislation. Oh, we have this chash. I don't think that's what the meaning here is. I think, at least for the Rebbe Rashab, what it means is as follows: that the Rabbanim felt there's no need to continue pursuing this mitzvah, especially when it became difficult, which we'll talk about more. Once it became difficult, and it stopped for whatever reason, for whatever historic reason you want to give, all of a sudden, now a Rav could say, do I need to go and make this extra effort to go discover and find and reinvent and all that? And same question do we have today? No. Given that there is this type of chash, it's enough for me to rely on that chash and say, you know something, we don't have to go and be active about this and pursue the Techeles. That's the way I think is the right way to understand these particular sources. This is the main nekuda that you get from the Rebbe Rashab's letter. It's a very interesting idea. It's wholly Kabbalistic, saying the reason I'm not going to do a mitzvahs I say that we is l'doiris. Halach, as much as the word isn't there in the pasuk, lahalach it's taka l'doiris. And yet, the reason we're not doing it is because of the Kabbalistic explanation paired together with the chash that maybe it's going to turn into a problem of Techeles. This is the main reason that Rebbe Rashab writes why I can't be maskim on this inyan. As noted before, this is very different from saying, I don't know if this is the chilazon, I don't know if this is the right color, we don't know what the right color is, I don't know how to dye it, I don't know how to test the dye. All of these, no, it's a very different factor. Now this is not the only point that we get in the letter. We also have another 2 points that I want to raise. And that is, Rebbe Rashab comments on 2 other things that the Radziner wrote in his Sfarim. One of them is a very simple question. If you follow the Kabbalistic model, it would seem there's got to be no Techeles once the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed. Because that's what he said. He said that Bizman HaBayis, fine, that you could tap audacious of Chachma. Once you reach Zman HaGolus, you can't. Didn't we say that Bizman HaMoroyim, even in the time of the Rabbanon Sivuroi, we still have Techeles going on? So how could that make sense? in the Ein HaTcheles, which is the third work that was written by the Radziner, he writes as follows: He himself, he quotes the Arizal. And he asks on the Arizal, doesn't the Arizal know that there was Techeles after the Churban? In the letter, the Rebbe Rashab gives 2 answers to this question. One answer is as follows: Einachanami, the Arizal knew that there was Techeles in the times of Amoraim. But what the Arizal is telling us, that it wasn't doing anything. The spiritual accomplishments wasn't happening. So yes, it existed, but the point is, it was kind of empty on a Kabbalistic level. That's the first explanation that Rebbe Rashab gives. But then he says deeper, look at 19, the second paragraph in 19, Yesh loimar, tifrgeret, the Tanoim v'Amoraim shayu achar ha'churban. They were able to tap the true Hamshacha. Why? Because they are Hashem's Beis HaMikdash. They're Hashem's Beis HaMikdash, not in a geographic sense, but in terms of human beings who are a Merkava, a dwelling place for Hashem, holy people, that's what they are. And he quotes the teaching, we actually don't have this teaching in Midrashim, but it's always quoted in the name of the Razal. When Hashem says He wants a Mishkan, it's not B'soichoi, I will dwell in the Mishkan, B'soicham, B'soichol echad v'echad in every person. That's every Jew. Okay, but we could all ask ourselves to what degree we can say that we're actually a pure Mishkan for Hashem. But Tzadikim, they are a pure Mishkan for Hashem. And so if they are, they're living pre-Churban. If they're living pre-Churban, they could still tap Oir of Chachma, and so therefore it makes sense for the greatest Tanoim and Amoraim to have Techeles. What about other people in that generation who weren't great tzaddikim? Okay, I don't know. He almost makes it sound like it was only the Tanoim and Amoraim during that generation who was wearing the Techeles. By the way, this is very similar to the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur model. Why? Not the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. To the Shofar model. Because what did we say? We said, Be'etzem, to tap Shofar, you need a bias edition. Because that's when, even though it's Shabbos, you could still gain surplus Shofar energies, is only in bias edition. We said in Bayis Sheni you couldn't, which is why we stopped universally blowing shofar on Shabbos, except for the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash is, even in an era when it's not happening, here is a place where it could happen. So the Rebbe Rashab is taking this model very seriously. The Rosh Hashanah model, he's matching it up inch for inch, how everything corresponds here too. Although the Zman Bayis Sheni is the time you could tap Oros of Chachma, you can't after. But the tzaddikim, they are a replica, so to speak, of the Beis HaMikdash, and so they're able to do it. And that's the answer he gives the Radziner's son about the question that his father had asked. That was one thing. One more thing, that is the following. In Ein Techeles, in the third work, he quotes the opposition from Rabbi Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik. This was the Rav in Brisk, who passed away the same time that the Radziner passed away. He also passed away in 1892. He is the author of the Beis Halevi, Reb Chaim Brisk's father. He said that he's against Chidush HaTcheles, as many of the Gdolei Yisrael were. Why is he against it? So in Ein Techeles, the Radziner quotes why Rabbi Soloveitchik was against it. What does he say? He says as follows. I'll summarize outside. We have to see what chilazon the Radziner is going to produce for us. If he produces for us a bria who has been lost and no one knows about it, and for hundreds of years no one has known about it, or maybe we knew about it but we didn't know it has ink, we didn't know it has dye in it, then maybe we have to listen to him. If, however, but what happened? If he produces a fish that we know, some entity that we know its existence, now we know its existence, we know for all these centuries that you're able to take ink from it, so then we for sure shouldn't listen to him. Why? Because then it means by the very fact, let's take 100 years before him, 200 years, let's say the Gra. The Gra lived in a time when this fish was known. The fact that ink could be extracted from it was known. And yet he didn't pursue it. So what does that mean? He didn't believe that it's the chilazon. So if you come to me with a new thing, like, okay, no one really knew about it, okay, we have to take you seriously. But it's like his language is, if you produce for us something that we know all this time, so it's as if we have a Kabbalah and a Messiah from our ancestors, that this marine creature and its colors, and that's exactly what happened in terms of the cuttlefish. The cuttlefish was used century after century, and it was always known, and it was used for dye. Painters used it. It was always known. And so therefore, the Beis Halevi said, we have a Messiah, this is not the chilazon. He goes into that first category, so to speak, of the Rabbanim, who said, I don't believe you, this is the chilazon that we referenced earlier. And this is what the Beis Halevi said at the time. So in Ein Techeles, the Radziner responded. And as we're going to see, this is going to be relevant for another part of the letter of the Rebbe Rashab. What did the Radziner respond? He says, I'm very unconvinced by what the Brisker Rav said. Why is that? You're telling me we have a negative Messiah, so to speak, that this is not the chilazon? We have no negative Messiah, this is not the chilazon. What happened here? Let's talk about the history of what happened. He says, Nizdaldalu Yisrael, Jewish people became impoverished. V'hochu begoyla achar goyla, they went from one exile to the next. Ad shaya eis, it came a certain time, shegalu v'nisrachaku harbe. They were distant very much, mechoyfei hayam, from the beaches where the chilazon is matzoi. And because of poverty and because exile was so difficult, they couldn't afford to send to the coast cities to get the chilazon. In addition, you had other external difficulties. You had gzeiras amim akadmoinim. The earlier nations had these rules. You didn't have permission. It was illegal to wear the color, this bluish color. unless they were like ministers in government. The Ramban writes, and Ramban has a passage in Parshas Tetzaveh, and he's discussing the fact that the Kohen Gadol had Techeles on him, and he says, the Ramban writing in the 1200s writes, Gam hayoim lo yorim lilbosh chutz memelech goyim. It's illegal. No person, I don't know if he's mamish means it's illegal or no one has the audacity to wear this color. It's color of royalty. And we do. So Radziner here is noting there was once a time that it was actually illegal for regular people. This was considered, there were times in societies this was highly regulated, what colors people wore, what type of garments people wore, and we do know from secular sources as well that there were rules about this. So he says, pile this all together and what happens? So all of a sudden you have a generation that doesn't observe the mitzvah. And once one generation stopped doing it, so all of a sudden we forgot. And we lost the tradition. I had to get this ink out. And so then that continues. So you're telling me we always knew this fish? No. Yeah, the fish always existed. But the people forgot that this is it. The people forgot that this is how you extract the dye. Don't tell me we have a negative Messiah about this fish. What we have is Jewish people who forgot that this is the fish. And this is how he sees it. And this is his response to the brisker Rav. Why is this relevant for our topic? Obviously, we're not doing tonight all the Rabbanim said. There's been volumes and volumes of works, each one coming with their angle. Our focus here is on the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab picks up on this point of the Radziner and comments about it, which is very interesting. He says like this, Gam hadavar hazeh, regarding the fact that you said, Litloi sibas bitula mikol Yisrael, saying the reason it disappeared from all of Jews, Gami echuda skula, including from individuals, is mishum yoiker mitziyusa shal Techeles, is because it was very expensive and difficult. Kaveh lekabel. The Rebbe Rashab says this theory is very difficult to accept. Why? I'll tell you why. Vishamaiti, because I want to tell you about my own ancestry. I heard Asher Bimeik v'Kdushas the Alter Rebbe. There was a certain war, great wars. I'm not sure which war exactly he's referring to, maybe the Napoleonic Wars of where Napoleon invaded Russia. And there was a worry, or it could be the earlier wars of Napoleon before he invaded Russia, same issue. There was a concern, there's not going to be Yaneve. There's a region in South Italy, it's called Calabria. That's where the Esrogim, the Alter Rebbe wanted his Esrogim from. The way they would come from Calabria to Eastern Europe is they would go north to Italy. There's another city called Genoa. That's where the name Yaneve comes from. The Esrogim don't grow in Yaneve, they grow in Calabria. But the shipping point was from Genoa. So here the concern was they weren't going to be able to get these Esrogim. And the Alter Rebbe wanted Lishloach Veratza Lishloach Shliach Miyuchad. He's going to send a special Shliach to Yaneve Lahavi Lo Yasreg. Whether he did or not, you don't have here in the story. But he was ready to. If that's what the Alter Rebbe did for an Esrig, then I think Doyle Yisrael would have done this for the Techeles. And yes, it's different. Why is it different? Esrig is Esrig. Go to Yaneve, get me an Esrig. How difficult should it be? Remember, it's before the time of Murkavim. That's an issue that started later. So we didn't have that concern so much. And definitely not in Italy. In the times of the Alter Rebbe, there was no concern of Esrogim Murkavim. So that's easy. But you're going to send a shliach to Techeles, you have to know what you're doing. You have to know which fish, you have to know how to extract the dye, you have to know all those things. So maybe, like you could say, you have Mesiras Nefesh to jump off the roof. You can't have Mesiras Nefesh to jump on the roof. Maybe that's what's happening. No, the Rashab doesn't think so. They wouldn't have let this go. Trying really hard to find this out. So therefore, he's saying, you're telling the Beis Halevi. The Beis Halevi said, we have a negative Messiah because it's been around, we always knew it, and we didn't use it. You say, no, what are you talking about? We forgot. I don't like the story of we forgot. I don't like the story that we just didn't have the ability and so we forgot. It doesn't make sense to me. If it were really important, we would have it. In other words, he's trying to build back his Kabbalistic argument. The Kabbalistic argument is we don't need it. And you have the Chashash of Kalayim. And that's why Gdei Yisrael didn't pursue it. They didn't pursue it because they had Mesiras Nefesh for everything. Here there was nothing to have Mesiras Nefesh for because they saw that there was no real reason to pursue it. That's the reason that fits the theory of the Rebbe Rashab that the Taka wasn't a need for it. Especially, he adds, if you consider another factor that the Radziner added. That is, Radziner has this whole point. Even if I'm wrong, I'm still right. What does that mean? He says that if you have, let's say it's not the chilazon, or let's say it's not being done right, you don't lose anything. Obviously, it's more sophisticated arguments in halacha about Techeles that we're not going to get into, but that's a fact that he tries to establish. Others disagreed with him, but he argued that even if I'm wrong, you're still better off. So it's a suffix that only is positive and has no potential for any loss. So Rebbe Rashab says that if you're right, then it makes my question even bigger. So the tzaddikim should have sent the people in the previous generations to figure this out. Because even if you're wrong, what's a big deal? So that only makes my case stronger, that it must be that they felt this was not something that was necessary, this was not needed, and the reason is the reason that Rebbe Rashab is presenting over here. So those are the three big ideas we have from the Rebbe Rashab in this letter. Or I guess you could say four. Number one, I saw this fish. Fascinating. I didn't pay too much attention to it, but it was 20 years ago I saw it, number one. Number two, I can't agree to this because we have a model of Kabbalah together with a Chash that paired together tell us this is not something that is necessary for today. And then he had the additional point of that, yes, it existed Achar HaChurban. How does that make sense in the Kabbalistic model? Because Tanoim and Amoraim are pre-Churban creatures. And in terms of the argument of how it fell away, historical difficulty, the Rebbe Rashab is not prone to accept that line of argument and wants to see it as the Rabbanim feeling that it wasn't really necessary to hold on to it and to keep it. Fine. So the Rebbe Rashab does not accept the Techeles. Some Jews are accepting it, the Radziner Chassidim are, and the story continues into the 20th century. And then a few years later after this, the Radziner Techeles takes a serious blow. And that's because he was a man who was later to become the chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog. He writes a doctoral dissertation on this subject, all about Techeles. And one of the things he does over there is he basically, for many people, disproved that the cuttlefish could be the chilazon. Why is that? Because he basically showed that there were obviously things that need to be mixed into the dye in order to make it work. He showed that all of the coloring, all of the blue, came from the added agents that have nothing to do with the ink that come from the cuttlefish. In fact, if you take other organic material and you take this same agents that the Radziner was using, you mix it in, you'll get the same color. So in other words, it has nothing to do, the dam chilazon, this mucus coming from the cuttlefish, was contributing zero to the color. And he writes there that he thinks that Radziner was misled. There was a chemist that he hired, and the chemist who he hired knew what he wanted, and so led him to where he thought his customer wanted to be. And when that happens, all of a sudden, many people who maybe would have been excited about the Techeles, all of a sudden they lost enthusiasm for it, and it remained that way for many, many years. In his dissertation, Rabbi Herzog explored the possibility of other things, snails, that could perhaps be the Techeles. One of the things he spoke about was something called the Murex trunculus snail, and we'll come back to that in a second. But the bottom line is, he also didn't settle on anything and say, this is for sure the Techeles, because even this Murex trunculus, one of the things he writes is that he only got purple. He wasn't able to get blue, and he thought it had to be blue. And so therefore, even you read his dissertation, you were left with question marks. And the result is, for much of the 20th century, the Techeles movement wasn't very strong. This explains, I think, why from the Rebbe you do not have a lot of material on this. From all the letters I was able to find, I found one letter in the Igros Kodesh. And what does it say in the Igros Kodesh? It's a letter from Tafshin Chai. Someone wrote, Test Thomas Tafshin Chai, someone wrote to the Rebbe about the Techeles. The Rebbe responds as follows: it is known that many Gdolei Yisrael were against this, and they were against it not only for Kabbalistic reasons, but also for reasons al pi nigla. The Rebbe Rashab did not agree. He writes, the Rebbe, I don't have his letter handy, but I remember seeing it. And he writes that al pi Kabbalah, we're only going to have Techeles la'asad lavoi, and we follow the words of the Rebbe Rashab. And he quotes the famous Gemara in Sukkah, where there was an Amir of Acha who said that he's going to follow the shita of his Rebbe about Hadassim, even though it's more kal, and even his Rebbe Rav Kana agrees it's better to have a different type of hadas, but because his Rebbe was matir, a more lenient type of hadas, Rav Acha cherished that and went with that, which teaches us about the loyalty one's supposed to have to their teacher, and so therefore we follow the Rebbe Rashab, and this is why we don't have the Techeles. Other than that, you don't really have much. There's an article in Talks and Tales. I only saw in the Hebrew edition of the Talks and Tales that talks about the Techeles. This came out in Tishrei Tavshin Chavav. It's interesting because it says over there that Radziner Rebbe came out with Techeles. Many don't accept it. The reason? Because we're not entirely sure what the right color we want from it is, which is very, very interesting reason. That's the one reason they hopped on to explain why they don't want to have the Techeles. Yes, it is true. There were Gedolei Yisrael who said that. I mentioned it earlier. What's the right color? It's not entirely clear. And for that reason, to say let's avoid the whole thing. Now we have to do an investigation, which I didn't do yet. Did this Shmuasin, is this Hebrew article a translation of English? Most of them are, but some of them are not. If it was written lechatchila in the Hebrew Shmuasin, the Sichas L'Noyar, so then it's one thing. If it was written lechatchila in English, it means it went by the Rebbe's desk, and the Rebbe reviewed these types of things and looked out for these types of things, and these things are more or less reliable. In fact, we have letters from like Reb Moshe Pinchas Katz and others writing how come Talks and Tales says such and such, but it's incorrect, and the Rebbe would respond. Like, the Rebbe took it very seriously, reviewed it, and it'll be very interesting if that passed the Rebbe, but I don't know how to find it in the English, so that'll be an interesting thing to see. That's another reference. Okay, now fast forward to the 1980s. The 1980s, there's someone who discovers how you can have this murex turn into blue. It basically needs more exposure to sunlight. And once you had that, many people said, okay, now this is the real chilazon. Again, you have to do an investigative research of, is this the real chilazon? You have all the questions that we asked before are relevant. In other words, if you opposed the Radziner because you didn't believe in this chilazon, now you have to say, is the murex a chilazon? If you oppose the Radziner because of color issues or dyeing issues or mixture issues or testing issues, so you have to revisit those questions for here. You have to see, are they still relevant? But from the Rebbe Rashab's perspective, the whole thing is irrelevant. I don't care if it's murex or not a murex. So the Rebbe Rashab would say that the whole thing is off the table. But anyway, that's why there was this renewed energy to the Techeles movement that happened in the late 1980s, and that's why today you go to the Techeles store, there's two types of Techeles. There's the Radziner Techeles, which is coming from the cuttlefish, and there is the more general Techeles that's coming from the murex, and that one's more popular, but it's also much more expensive. Much, much more expensive. Okay. Now let's conclude with the following. This is a Sikha, the Rebbe, Nukut Sikha Chelek Ches, page 101, where he tells us the Hoira of Techeles, the Hoira of Lavan, and the Hoira of the fact that we don't have Techeles B'zman Hazeh. Here, rather than them corresponding to Chochmah and Bina, they correspond to Chesed and Gvura, which is interesting. So it goes as follows. Lavan corresponds to Ava, the Avodah of Ava. That's the Avodah of Asay Toiv. Do good, add in light, love, positive, that type of emotion. Techeles, that corresponds to the avoid of sur meira and the avoid of yira. Okay, both of these are important to have. Therefore, was bisman hazeh is nita kein techeles, having no techeles today, and all of our strings are lavan is ahira, is a lesson, as their ikir avoida is in the kafon ava, that the main focus that has to be in our generation, and I guess this means in all generations since the Techeles has disappeared, has to be in the avodah of ava. Okay, of course yira is important, but even here the question is emphasis. The emphasis has to be on the idea of ava. This is for all of Judaism. Our relationship with Hashem, thinking about our relationship with Hashem. You can think of it in a very yira-dika way. You can think about it in an ava-dika way. Or thinking about how Hashem relates to you. You can think about it with where God loves me, which is more avadik, or less so. How we relate to fellow Jews. Avas Yisrael emphasized more, or I don't know, maybe teichacha, reprimanding other Jews being emphasized more. And likewise, Avas HaTorah, the love for Torah. And so the fact that we don't have Techeles today teaches us that the Ikar Avodah in all these areas has to be Ava. Ubefrat al pi Pnimius HaTorah, when we consider the teachings of Pnimius HaTorah, so you have an interesting passage of Rashbi in the Zohar. The Rashbi in the Zohar tells on the Haftarah, the second day Shavuos, where there's a pasuk from Habakkuk that says, Hashem, Shamati Shimacha Yoresi, God, I heard about you. I had Yira, indeed, the whole scene. What's the scene of Matan Torah? Vayaram Vayanu, Vayamdu Meirachak, they're running away, they're very afraid. Rashbi says, he reads this passage and he says, that was good for then. Anan, for us, we have to focus on the love. Chavivusa. We have to focus on the love. And so this is a special emphasis that we gain from Kabbalah and from Chassidus. The Rebbe once said in the Sikha of Nasai Tavshem Memches that accordingly, when you're having a difficult day, and something's going hard, you are empowered to think about the fact that the Eibishter loves you. The Eibishter loves you. Ahafti eschem amar Hashem. The Rashbi quotes that pasuk. Let's focus on those psukim, the psukim of love. And when you realize during that difficult day that the Eibishter loves you, so number one, all of a sudden the difficulty doesn't seem so difficult. The challenge doesn't seem unbearable anymore. And number two, it's also going to inspire in us the idea of Avas Hashem. And so, tomorrow morning, or tonight, when you look at your tzitzis, and you notice that it doesn't have any Techeles, you should have it as a reminder that, yes, Yira is important, and these things are important, but we need to emphasize love. The love of Torah, the love of Hashem, and the love of a fellow Jew.